Chapter 3. We must have done something wrong. The book of Genesis represents the act of becoming conscious as breaking of a taboo, as though the gaining of knowledge meant that the sacred barrier had been impiously overstepped. Young. I shall speak to my Lord, though I be dust and ashes, if I vilify myself and bring me to naught, and fail from all manner of proper reputation, thought of myself, and make me dust as I am, thy grace shall be merciful to me. Thomas A. Kempis. Wherever the religious neuroses have appeared on the earth so far, we find it connected by three dangerous prescriptions as to regimen: solitude, fasting, and sexual abstinence. Nietzsche. We must have done something wrong, otherwise there wouldn't be death. This reasoning has led the races of mankind to make a cruel and foolish and sometimes beautiful spectacle of themselves, according to a higher authority which exists only in their own heads. Imagine how mystifying our behavior would seem to a task force of interplanetary explorers from Alpha Centauri, especially if they had no idea of death. From their viewpoint, gazing down on us from the windows of their saucers, members of the strange colony below would seem periodically to go mad, with the outbreaks taking both weirdly personal and ceremonial forms. Consider the neurotic circus we put on. Earth people are forever falling into agonized postures, extending their arms in supplication, and knocking their heads on the ground. They gather regularly to listen to one of their number talk, or speak in unison, ring bells, or blow mournful horns, light candles, and fall down. Then they lift their heads and with a blending of voices give utterance to strangely beautiful outcries. In these states, are the inhabitants suffering or enjoying themselves? Does some sort of gain result? Impossible to tell. Earth people may also be observed bursting into others' holy places, running around and flailing one another with whips, killing goats, spreading out victims on crosses, kissing big rings, dousing each other in the water, bowing to a distant heap of buildings, jumping up and down, waving little red books at other people and forcing them to their knees, weighting the legs of bonneted housewives and tossing them in the river. In solitude, sitting for years on top of pillars in the desert, twisting their bodies and spirits into crooked shapes and holding the position until it becomes permanent. Other figures shuffle around under bejeweled headpieces, red hats, black hats, tall and little flat hats, and suddenly drop down to their knees, singingly, or together, talking to themselves. Still others dance around huge poles with faces painted on them, spin in dust clouds, fall down, eat dirt, kiss trees, and moan and chant at sunset. This vaudeville of despair, performed so far as we know, before no audience but the players themselves, might be judged a terrible waste of time and energy, but until now it has served to ward off mass suicide. In our tragic and also stupid situation, the worship of imaginary forces has been essential. Without false gods to console and torment us, the haphazard nature of existence could not have been born. After all, our working conditions are impossible. At the end of a short life, the gift of self, which in the individual has never asked for but now desperately treasures, is torn from him. Sometimes this happens violently, more often in the process of natural death, which, as George Orwell has said, almost by definition means something slow, smelly, and painful. In whatever way the end comes, our identities are summarily dissolved, like overboiled turnips, with no explanation or excuse given. How to account for this appalling cosmic whim? From the start, we counted annihilation simply by refusing to believe in it. Death in this world, which requires that we survive in the next, is imagined by a great many peoples as an unnatural state of affairs visited on man by mistake, or as a result of some primordial misunderstanding, and all the world may become guilty before God, warned St. Paul in the Epistle to the Romans. Guilt in its oppressive form belongs largely to the Jews and the Christians, but tribally rough equivalents to explain death exist almost everywhere. Rationalizations of mortality are commonly based on one or more of three mythic misfortunes: primal crime, original sin, etc., a misunderstood message from on high, and an improper response to divine command. A variation to be taken up later is that man himself, in his individual form, is a sort of mistake spun off from central consciousness and seeking to rejoin it. Superstitious man looks ahead, musing, "This jungle must once have been a garden. What went wrong?" Now familiar excuses follow, represented mythically in a downfall. Somebody, like Prometheus, Eve, stole something, fire, knowledge, presumptuously crossed a line, failed to recognize a deity come down to earth, accidentally or purposefully attacked the descending god, blasphemed, failed to get the message, peeked from the bushes at forbidden mysteries, and so we are mortal. These examples taken from the Golden Borough, Part 4, The Scapegoat, can be multiplied many times. The Ururaks of the British Guiana say that man was created by a good being whom they called Goramani. Once on a time, this kindly creator came to earth to see how his creature man was getting on, but men were so ungrateful that they tried to kill their maker. Hence he took from them the gift of immortality and bestowed it upon animals that change their skin, such as snakes, lizards, and beetles. Again, the Tamanchias, an Indian tribe of the Orinoco, tell the Creator kindly intended to make men immortal by telling them that they should change their skins. He meant to say that by doing so they should renew their youth like serpents and beetles, but the good tidings were received with such incredulity by an old woman that the Creator changed his tune and said very curtly, "Ye shall die." In Annam, Vietnam, they say that the Ngoc Hoang sent a messenger from heaven to inform men that when they reached old age they should change their skins and live forever, but that when serpents grew old they must die. Unfortunately for the human race, the message was perverted in the transmission, so that men do not change their skins and therefore mortal, whereas serpents do cast their old skins and accordingly live forever. Anthropological literature is filled with stories of this kind, as well as Götterdämmerungs and apocalypses. All such accounts relate to one primal transgression. The myths that sustain mighty orthodoxies and wistful folk tales combine in a flow of guilt depriving from the impudence of being human. Put another way, in nearly every culture, humanity has always felt that it must pay for being itself. We pay for having dared achieve separated consciousness. This is the crime of becoming, in our own imagination, a threat to the gods. Understandably, we have been frightened by our boldness, resisting death even by mentioning the failure to overcome it. Men dimly fear that their gods will uncover their seedling of insurrection and react angrily by crushing our survival project. The revolt against oblivion was preceded by centuries of petitions. Men apologized for existing. Ceremonially and in solitude they pleaded, "Gods, pardon me for being, and if there is any way to arrange it, though I am unworthy, let me be." Attempts to resist death by placating the gods invariably begin with the principles of sacrifice. This is a form of spiritual bribery, as explained in the Bhagavad Gita. The Creator, O Lord of progeny, created at the same time the sacrificial ritual and man. And he said to man, through this ritual shalt thou progress. It will fulfill thy desires. Thou shalt please the gods with its help, and in return the gods will protect thee. Thus, helping one another, thou shalt gain true happiness. Pleased with thy worship, the gods will grant thee all enjoyments. Sacrifice crops, ears of corn, vegetables, and so on. This may seem to help bring on richer harvests, but obviously does nothing to preserve the body from death. Offer up animals and we still die. To save ourselves from eternity, offer up a captive human life. If this is what you want, here, take it. Throw some alien into the pit. 5, 10, 100 strangers. At last, this having failed, we begin to understand. What the authorities want is a piece of ourselves, and specifically our pleasure. Now the spirit of self-sacrifice comes into being. The self-punishing man walks about large areas of the earth, animated by the conviction that unrestrained enjoyment without a balance of suffering will displease the gods. Knowing this, the Navajo cowboy, Boston security analyst, and the Nagasaki fisherman pay before or after pleasure, also bow down, pay regularly self-imposed tribute to the celestial authority, so that compensatory misfortune will not be due. We pay small or several dues. Knocking on wood, for instance, costs nothing. Refusing to eat meat on a Friday is somewhat greater inconvenience. The day-long fast during Ramadan, the Muslim period of atonement, can result in prolonged and gnawing discomfort. Most devices to even up fortune involved, at the very least, the sacrifice of comfort or pleasure. All follow the rules of divine mathematics, which promises that the less you live now, the more you live later. If you restrict exuberance now, or take a little off the top, prudently tithing it, or that much or more will be credited to your survival account in the bank of heaven. Under this system, pain and self-denial becomes money in the bank. They gather a compound interest in the form of voluntary non-being that the gods must pay back by granting you being after death. Faith in this double-entry bookkeeping of the spirit is made possible by civilized man's neurotic devotion to symmetry. Many of us who think we believe in nothing conduct our affairs as though a symmetrical balance sheet of retribution and reward actually were being kept somewhere. Without knowing it, even atheists may find themselves obeying an economics of immortality. This encourages us to bank on abjuration or suffering, and to build providence later. Though a system of prepaid punishment, we establish credit to cover the future beyond time. A type of ascetic individual hopes to discount death by thinking about it at all hours, and in some instances pretending to want it. For example, the English monk Thomas à Kempis. If it be dreadful to die peradventure, it is more perilous to live long. Blissful is he that hath the hour of his death ever before his eyes, and every day dispossesseth himself to die. When it is morning, think that thou shalt not come to the even, and when even cometh, be not bold enough to promise thyself the morning. Wherefore be ever ready, and live so that death find thee never unready. He, of course, the exponent of this fearful philosophy, lived to be 91. Still, the life-denying appeal to refrain now, live later, does not seem very attractive. Is there not something dishonest in making a virtue of withdrawal? Or in elevating what may be nothing more than abject fear of experience to the status of holiness? 100 years ago in Massachusetts, the moral mathematics of this self-punishing man produced this classic caricature of misery from the story of a bad boy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. And then I had a cloud at home. It was Sunday. The deep gloom which had settled over everything set in like a heavy fog early on Saturday evening. At 7 o'clock, my grandfather comes smilelessly downstairs. He is dressed in black and looks as if he has lost all his friends during the night. Miss Abigail, also in black, looks as if she was prepared to bury them. Breakfast progresses in silence. My grandfather sits in a mahogany chair, reading a large Bible covered with green baize. Miss Abigail occupies one end of the sofa and has her hands crossed stiffly in her lap. I sit in the corner, crushed. My grandfather looks up and inquires in a sepulchral voice if I am ready for the Sabbath school. I go to meeting. Our minister holds out very little hope to any of us being saved. Convinced that I am a lost creature in common with the human family, I return home behind my guardians at a snail's pace. We have a dead cold dinner. I saw it laid out yesterday. More recently, in Report to Greco, Nico Kazanskis tells how, during his first trip to Florence, he felt so joyful that he became terror-stricken. For, as I well know, the gods are envious creatures, and it is hubris to be happy and to know that you are happy, in order to exercise their evil eye. I have recourse to comic schemes for diminishing my happiness. I remember being so elated in Florence that I realized the rights according to humans had overstepped. I had to find some way of suffering, so I went and bought a pair of shoes much too narrow for me. I put them on in the morning, and I suffered so much that I could not walk. I hopped about like a crow. All that morning until midday I was miserable, and when I changed shoes and went out for a walk in the afternoon, what joy! The economics of immortality lead men to keep books of virtue which they look forward to opening up for Olympian credit investigators. Thoreau, with his miraculous expense accounts at Walden Pond, was really proclaiming to heaven that he had cost little, that he was a modest, inexpensive man. What a bargain! At times, he wrote like an accountant of the spirit. Goodness is the only investment that never fails. In the music of the harp, which trembles around the world, it's insisting on this which never thrills us. The harp is the travelling putterer for the universe's insurance company, recommending its laws, and little goodness is all the assessment that we pay. Though the youth at last grows indifferent, the laws of the universe are not indifferent, but are forever on the side of the most sensitive. Thoreau being among the sensitive, this translates, I and my kind qualify for eternal life. Work without enjoyment for its own sake is one of the more unhappy measurements of virtue that superstitious man has imposed on himself. It may not only be caricatured as the curse of the drinking classes and the opiate of the people, but also summed up more seriously by Durkheim as, for most men, a punishment and a scourge, and by Norman Brown as pure self-punishment, and therefore a pure culture of guilt. Until lately, mercantile groups have remained under the spell of the pronouncement in Genesis that because Adam and his mate sinned, we must earn our bread with the sweat of our faces. Or in modern office terms, we must at least put in time, seem to work. For this reason, proposals to establish a guaranteed annual income cannot help but inspire fear and anger among business people. The awful thought arises that a passage to happiness is possible without paying off the gods by going through the mill. If this is true, then the sacrifices through toil merely waste us. We have been tricked. Suffering is a waste of man-hours. Once the law enables loafers to spend the day happily strumming guitars, the structure of symmetrical retribution tumbles down, and the expiating power of labour stands exposed for what it is, a dismissal superstition. Of all the tribulations men have visited on themselves to gain or regain immortality, the most grievous has been that of interfering with their own sexual enjoyment. Evidently, those who fear death most, fear the body most, and what Herbert Marcuse defines as the universal guilt which is life itself, the life of the body, quite naturally fixes on the body's greatest pleasure. Self-punishing man hit on the idea that the most self-punishing man. I will pass through. Okay. Self-punishing man hit on the idea that the act most pleasurable to us must be the one that offends the lords of death, because in the midst of it we pay no attention to them. Lustful coupling makes us forget death, fate, and the gods, for in our thrashings we are creating a little immortality of our own. Members of all religious establishments tend to regulate this sort of thing. In the presence of sexual anarchy, they become apprehensive, fearing that such heedless delight, unless paid for, will irritate our divine overseers. To avoid retribution, the self-punishing man has tried for centuries to enclose lust within the framework of sacraments. The idea was, and among the Orthodox still is, to make all such pleasure a divine gift. Lust is considered proper only within a legal setting. This sometimes leads to disconcerting outbreaks. For those who think they have withdrawn from the flesh, sensuality may rush in at sacred moments. John of the Cross laments, Satan, who in order to disquiet the soul during prayer, causes the filthy movements of our lower nature. Some persons not only relax in their prayers through fear of those movements, but even abandon them altogether, for they imagine that they are most liable to these assaults than at other times. Exactly so, because prayer is an interlude of approved ecstasy, a devotion beyond reproach. Within communion, all feelings are sanctified, and it ought not to be surprising that previously blocked off sexual excitements come pouring through without fear. For 2,000 years or more, Norman Brown observes, man has been subjected to a systematic effort to transform him into an aesthetic animal. This tendency has been inspired across the centuries by a strung-out band of prophets and disciples, themselves seized and dominated by overwhelming visions of immortality. Prophets are curious individuals, highly sensitive to personal extinction, and more afraid of it than the general run of man. At once God imitator and God-fearer, the prophet intends to lead the rest of us along the right path. He does this in order to win the favour of the gods in his own mind, so that he himself will become divine, thus taking the high road to his own rebirth. The man shouts, hoping to be overheard by heaven, confident that a gold star will be placed next to his name on the Olympian bullet board. Most successful holy men, with a long-range influence on history, have tended to preach restraint. They and the disciples and orthodoxies following them have two reasons to rein in pleasure. Suspecting the play without compensating pain or homage leads to death, they also darkly and contrarily wonder whether devotees of open-ended excitement with no dues to be paid just might know something about life and death that the more docile elements of the hillside have forgotten or never knew. The prophet and his eventual orthodox followers must reject all extreme experiences not in accord with the original vision. This is true not only for the reason that the gods might become angry with the sinners and kill man's immortality dream, but also paradoxically because they might not be angry at all. Sinners of every description, lovers, wild dancers and singers, organists, drinkers, hashish smokers, and the recently psychedelic voyagers get out of time on their own, escaping the consequences of primal crime by means of ecstasy. They knock out our mortal mathematics, This affronts the worshippers of symmetry. Unabashed sin threatens the orthodox seekers after heaven in two ways. If the unruly among us are in the wrong, the hubris of their unpaid for ecstasy will rub off on everyone, as in Sodom and Gomorrah, ruining the community's chances for eternal life. But worse, if the sinners, the ecstatic dancers, are right and closer to the gods than we are, if ecstasy endears them to the gods, then our orthodox restraint has been a fool's game, and our cherished right conduct, far from bringing us closer to heaven, has kept us farther away from the immortal state than all those heedless revelers who haven't even been forced to pay. The same double-edged fear accounts for the violent reaction to heresy characteristic of all orthodoxes. Desaid urged that no law should be passed against religious crimes, for he who offends against a myth offends against no one. But in practice, this is not so. He who offends against a myth frightens everyone who has been trying to believe in it. The heretic's approach to immortality threatened others' hope of survival by bringing the wrong approach to the gods into the open. The heretic or infidel jeopardizes our standing with higher authority. We go after him just as we should throw over a man boring a hole in our lifeboat. Origen of Alexandria offered just such a threat. He earned the condemnation of the church by hoping out loud that God would not persist in his vengeance forever, but after a time realize. I'm not going to cut this out. But after a time release the damned souls from torture. The modest hope that merciful Christ would not accept the eternal damnation of a single soul was enough to cast Origen out. The fathers who condemned him feared that mercy carried to excess would imbalance the immortality equation, which, because of our neurotic devotion to symmetry, awards or denies eternal life in accordance with the mortal mathematics of retribution. There was also the fear that the Almighty would become incensed if he thought we presumed to anticipate his mercy. In fact, Origen's hope must be everyone's innermost hope, even that of the authorities who excommunicated him. But magic has always required that we pretend to expect worse from the gods than we suspect they will deal out. As a prisoner, when asked by a cruel barbarian chieftain, "What do you think is going to happen to you?" may reply in a despondent and hopeless tone that he expects a horrible fate. He does this in the hope that, placated by his premature terror, the chief will not carry out the punishment the captor has already gone through by a suitable show of fear. Similarly, a criminal may tell the judge that he deserves the electric chair, with the hope that by admitting this, he will excite a sort of appreciation and obtain a reduced sentence. But a plea that does not deserve the chair will very likely cause the judge to find him unrepentant, hence more eligible than ever, as a recent sex murderer put it, to ride the lightning. Heresy hunters are also driven to emotional extremes by another, equally important concern, the notorious imprecision of the gods when it comes to distributing punishment en masse. We imagine that the divine justice meted out to individuals will be precisely symmetrical, but retribution brought down on large numbers has always been sloppy. Disasters inflicted by fortune, the gods, all too frequently sweep away the just along with the unjust. The rain of fire descends on many harmless citizens. Job's retainers were wasted for no reason they knew. There must have been some good people in Sodom. The prophet fears that through divine negligence, God will not distinguish him from other mortals, will drop flames on him as well as the unrighteous. Therefore, he and his followers demand that we demonstrate before heaven that our heretical neighbor is offensive to us, that we have nothing to do with his way of thinking. The retribution should wipe him away, not us, and if retribution does not manifest itself, we will wipe him out. Finally, vengeful pursuit of the heretic, as with the traditional persecution of those advocating open-ended ecstasy, is intensified by the outside chance that he may have the ear of the gods, may even be influencing them by his charm. Thus heresy advances no mere difference of opinion, even if the wrong heretical magic and charm may amuse the gods and win their favour, and thereby, summoning up divine intervention, alter reality. If I am orthodox, heresy threatens my claim to immortal being, since there can be no more frightening threat to my superstitious nature. Heretical charm, unless I have a stake in it, must be destroyed as soon as possible, and all memory of it made contemptible. The urgent measures required to accomplish this have been brought into being that what Nietzsche describes as a great ladder of religious cruelty. The ladder reaches towards heaven, and cruelty comes down. Even in mythic times, superstitious man secretly doubted that the authorities would respond to his appeasement techniques by granting him eternal life. He continued, sometimes prudently, sometimes passionately, to worship one set of gods or another, but meanwhile began taking steps to win his freedom from death, with or without their consent. Chapter 4. The disguised drive to become divine. If mass death sentences defines the human condition, then rebellion, in one sense, is its contemporary. At the same time that he rejects his mortality, the rebel refuses to recognize the power that compels him to live in this condition. Camus. If you keep the opposition between God and man, then you finally arrive, whether you like it or not, at the Christian conclusion that all good comes from God and that all evil from man, with the absurd result that the creature is placed in opposition to its creator, and positively cosmic or demonic grandeur in evil is imputed to men. Young. Men have always half-knowingly plotted against their own gods, even while worshipping them. Evidence of elaborately camouflaged rebellion against the divine order, which allows us to die, is revealed in large areas of the world among cultures unaware of one another's existence. Our species may be described as living in a state of permanent revolution against the gods. It would have been impossible for such resistance not to develop, given A. the persistent longing for individual immortality, and B. fear of divine retribution, C. a disguised drive to usurp privileges of divinity, principally the immortal state that goes with it, must sooner or later animate all concerned. This prototype of all revolutions takes passive and active forms of varying intensity. It has led since our mythic dawn to a politics of immortality, similar in form and character to earthly politics. This struggle against the tyranny of death has been waged, as it is against every tyranny, by conservative, moderate, and extreme factions of the human spirit, with heresies bedeviling each of these forces. In the drive to share or take over divine power, our species has proposed to deal with its imaginary gods in 4 ways: to placate, impress, imitate, or destroy them. The politicians of immortality split and wrangle, as do earthly politicians, over the best ways to get around the establishment and set up a new order of things. Hence, the groups hoping to win immortality by different techniques continually struggle against one another as well as against death. Advocates of soft-line approach to divine authority, in the main more fearful primitives, and the great orthodoxies set out to propitiate the gods rather than knock them down. As seen in Chapter 3, they rest their hopes on celestial justice of some kind of everlasting mercy. Death can be avoided by right conduct, demonstrations and celebrations of love and fear, systematic pleading with the authorities, ostentatious sacrifice, self-denial, and at the extreme, grovelling before heaven and mutilation of one's being through such means as self-torture, vows of silence, etc. A second, more practical group hopes to earn eternal life by individual enterprise, impressing the absentee lords by by good or mighty works, showing off one's achievements before an all-powerful presence or jury in order to qualify for the life to come. A third revolutionary wing is convinced that the best means of becoming God is to act like one, to build, create, or destroy like one, to pass for a god now and thereby pass unchallenged into the immortal state later on. Humanity's radical wing, growing stronger by the decade, has devoted its energies for more than 500 years not to joining the company of imagined gods, but rather to overthrowing the celestial ruling class, replacing these deities and even finally becoming them. The slow-working universal solvent developed to accomplish this end has been inductive research. Probings into every corner of knowledge carry forward the race's enduring project to gain complete dominance, divine power, over all processes that might affect the human form. This effort represents the boldest self-assertion of our species, our supreme aggression against the death-dealing environment, camouflaged by outward humility. What we call pure science serves as the arm of pure rebellion. It aspires to nothing less than the supreme being. In theory, the race's radical wing moves ahead disinterestedly, searching, but in the end, beyond the succession of limited objectives along the way, the quarry being hunted down as death. In only one respect does the rebellion against death differ greatly from all others. Earthly plotters think they know what they are about. They can readily identify their objectives, to blow up the arsenal, overthrow the king or the system, but the plot against the gods, though race-wide, moves forward on a conscious level unshared. It evolves in each earthling's spiritual underground. To deceive celestial authority, the plotters must also deceive themselves in order to dare carry on their project. In short, the drive to become immortal and divine involves such enormous hubris that the final goal has remained unnameable, revealed only a little here and there, most of the time being shrouded from the perception of the revolutionaries themselves. Man, as unconscious plotter, may have shown good sense here. Perhaps he dimly realized the undesirability of premature revelation. So long as technologically the race was in no position to do anything about death, the revolutionary goal revealed too soon would have been unbearable to contemplate. In these circumstances, the creation of gods and all superstitions based on their existence answered a tactical need. Such superstitions may have helped the species avoid summoning the unthinkable to consciousness, that the gods' most devastating vengeance on us may take the form of a revelation that they do not exist, that no life-rescuing force exists. Hope of immortality would then have been thrown back on what were recently our small scientific talents, only now with the state of the medical art making our liberation from mortality at least imaginable, has the thought that we can actually become gods free of time been permitted to the surface. The permanent revolution against death has always taken place in a wilderness of symbols, disguising the dangerous project, keeping it below the level of consciousness. Men necessarily obstruct their own advancement toward the divine state. People of the earth not only trample on others for misbehaving before the gods, but also, individually, persecute themselves when they feel dangerous thoughts coming on. Negotiations with imaginary powers and our own powers must be conducted with the most delicate hypocrisy. In the manner of Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh, we negotiate while fighting. This is done by making deals with the prevailing superstitions. In effect, as a race, we intrigue against our own neuroses. The 4 lines of action: to placate, impress, imitate, or destroy the celestial establishment, contend with one another, as groups or individuals with different life programs collide. The same conflicting tendencies are also likely to exist together in one person, frequently setting him at cross purposes from himself. In fact, it is rare for any one of us not to follow several or all of these approaches to the gods at one time or another. We are several kinds of revolutionaries at once, and the drive towards immortality advances amid confusion, though a wildly superstitious country. A religious naturalist, Charles Darwin, undercuts the structure of faith, formulating the evolutionary hypothesis. An industrialist, in brutal displays of power, imitating God on earth, may alternatively bully his associates and give them unexpected presents, but on Sundays he gets down on his knees in church. Geniuses and others devoted to building new forms and shattering old ones, assuming the godlike power to create and destroy. Those engaged in pure research, breaking down the god's mysteries one by one. Discoveries of a new vaccine, reducing the provenance of death, all complete with the childish jealousy for the attention of a god they may not think they believe in, to make sure that their achievements make a greater impression on the recording angel than those of a rival. The middle-class conformist placates heaven and earth, beginning not to be unduly singled out, but secretly he plans to perpetuate his consciousness, slipping into immortality unnoticed on a group ticket. The Red Guards of China slash ancient scrolls and deface statues of the Buddha, knocking down gods who have outlived their usefulness, and at the same time intoxicated by the illusion of timeless youth, roam the countryside putting dunce caps on their seniors in a mass exercise of god imitation. Functional hypocrisy still governs the project to overcome death, in that we deliberately keep ourselves ignorant of what we are doing. This is no more noticeable than in public ceremonies, which presumably the gods are watching more closely than private ones. Startling cultural lags are likely to be in evidence in such affairs. Gatherings of people suddenly become religious. For instance, in formal dedications of new schools, medical laboratories, telescopes, spaceships, and computers, speakers usually invoke the blessing or inspiration of some deity, God, Buddha, Allah, Lenin, Mao, etc. In other words, tools designed to break apart the miracle, mystery, and authority that Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor deemed essential to man, are regularly dedicated to miracle, mystery, and authority. Why should this be so? Why are the gods summoned forth at this point, blown up like nodding balloons, and presented to us? Because although we are inventing the tools to destroy authority, we are still afraid of them. Out of an old ancestral memory, we fawn on what we propose to attack. True, this may be nothing more than a matter of form, yet lip service is given only to what we think possesses at least vestiges of power. Thus the rebellion against mortality proceeds along crisscrossing lines of action, shot through with neuroses, resisting its own discoveries, interfering with itself in every possible way. We have never been able to decide, for instance, whether to seek earthly or heavenly paradise, whether to earn immortality in this world or the next. Even though the two drives move in the same direction, they must always conflict. One destroys mystery, the other preserves or celebrates it. Again, both tendencies can be found within each of us. The plotters of earthly and heavenly paradise have fought, slandered, and sabotaged one another for hundreds of years. One stands accused of unbridled hubris, risking divine retaliation, jeopardizing everybody's chances. The other of superstition, cringing before mystery, and each finds the other obstructing the road to eternal life. The drive to join or replace the gods has often been masked in fables which ostensibly makes the point that any such effort is foolish. Here, slightly abridged, with italics added, is a classic example of this masked desire, the Tower of Babel story from Genesis. And the whole earth was of one language, and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, Go to let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and then there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all of the earth, and they left off to build the city, therefore in the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all earth. The chronicler dutifully sets down a parable which frustrates his people's desire, but the failure to build the tower disguises a warning. The desire to create such a structure that may reach unto heaven remains very much alive, and we are not to forget it. The Lord speaks dryly. You can hear his weary impatience, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them. Obvious enough, but still easy to forget. All these observations, such as nothing will be restrained from them, are man-made. The storyteller imagines a not too severe punishment for the challenging desire to erect a tower. In a sardonic mood, the Lord sets the foolish builders to crackling In sardonic mood, the Lord sets the foolish builders to cackling incomprehensibly among themselves. The thrust of the tower is considered foolish rather than wicked. The disguised message in the Tower of Babel story is that we get together and talk in one language. We can erect a structure that will reach heaven, in other words, become gods ourselves, and attain immortality. Knowing his own ambition, man, in the person of the chronicler, guesses that God must be nervous. He has the Lord read man's intentions accurately and put them down humorously. No one suffers in this story. We have simply placed on the record of our plan of action, which is some day to win a share in heaven. Yet, as in all such myths, we do our best to deceive the authorities by cloaking an early venture in failure. Neglecting to cover up our project can be dangerous. When the desire to become immortal and divine is revealed in undisguised form, it usually meets with angry or scornful resistance. Paul found this, as Anonimo pointed out, in Athens, the noble city of the intellectuals. In Aparagus, home of free discussion, Paul stands before the subtle Athenians, men of culture and tolerance who are ready to welcome and examine every doctrine. But when he begins to speak of the resurrection of the dead, their stock of patience and tolerance comes to an end, and some mock him, and others say, We will hear thee again of this matter, intending not to hear him. Open, as opposed to subtly veiled, discussion of life after death was what irritated the loungers of Athens. The crude vision of resurrection expressed the desire in too direct fashion for the sophisticates of the time. Similarly, today, the idea of aiming toward and sometime attaining immortality on earth has been angrily or derisively rejected by the most highly educated people. Yet, once this same dream of immortality is subtly disguised, every vision is permitted. In the war against death, hypocrisy continues to be our secret strength. See, for example, how the race's drive to live forever has been carefully projected onto the image of man's great enemy.